Hello, this is Matt Pullen, and today we're going to be talking about a trap in the Ruy Lopez opening, also known as the Spanish game. The Ruy Lopez starts e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. And this is one of the most common openings in play today, and definitely the most common double king pawn opening. And the defense we'll be looking at is the Steinitz defense with pawn to d6. And the Steinitz defense is not as popular today because it's very defensive. It allows white to achieve his goals in the center quite easily. And if white plays the trap that I'm about to show you, the Tarrasch trap, then black is forced to give up his center. So let's say white plays d4 on this move, and if black gives up his center by playing e takes d, queen takes d, because the knight's pinned, then white will end up with a pawn on e4 as opposed to black's pawn on d6, which will give white a space advantage. So this is what to avoid if you're playing the Steinitz defense for black. You don't want to just give white this small space advantage for nothing. So let's say black plays bishop to d7 to break the pin on the knight c6. This is a necessary move because let's say black plays f6, knight f6 instead, attacking the pawn on e4. Well, white can play pawn to d5, attacking the knight which is pinned on c6. So black has to kick the bishop, and the bishop drops back to a4, maintaining this pin. So then black breaks the pin, and white captures, black captures, and after knight c3, black has a totally lifeless game because his c, d, and e pawns all can't move. So even though he has the bishop pair to white's bishop and knight, there's no real way to use the bishop pair because black can't create any space. So that is a refutation of knight f6. So that's why you see bishop to d7 in this opening. So white can castle, and black plays knight f6. White defends it with knight c3. This is another advantage white has over the regular Ruy Lopez lines. Usually white has to put a pawn on c3 in order to play d4. But he doesn't have to do that here, so the white knight can come out to c3 instead of the inferior square d2. So let's say black finishes his development with bishop to e7, and then white plays rook to e1. This sets the Tarrasch trap in the Steinitz Ruy Lopez. So far, black has managed to hold his pawn on e5, his point in the center. But rook to e1 forces black to give up his point in the center and play pawn takes pawn. He'll get a cramped yet kind of playable game after knight takes. But let's say that black does not know about the Tarrasch trap and he castles. Well, then white plays the following combination. Bishop takes knight, bishop takes bishop, pawn takes pawn, pawn takes pawn, and now queen takes d8. And first we'll look at rook a takes d8, which is the most intuitive because the rook on a8 is further away from the action than the rook on f8. But rook a takes d8, and now knight takes e5, and it looks like white's just won a pawn, but the pawn on e4 can be taken. Not by knight takes e4, because then knight takes c6, and black is just losing. But rather, black plays bishop takes e4, and after bishop takes, knight takes. White cannot play rook takes e4 because of checkmate. So instead, white has to play the knight on d3. And now black has a serious problem because the knight and the bishop are both unprotected. So black plays f5 to defend the knight, and then white plays f3. And this is the game Tarrasch Marco from 1892, where Marco played bishop to c5 check, and then after Tarrasch played knight takes bishop, he showed that white has a won game because knight takes knight, bishop to g5. And if this rook moves anywhere, then bishop to e7 forks the rook on f8 and the knight on c5. For instance, rook f7 and then pawn to c4, and this rook cannot move anywhere while still guarding the knight. So that is Tarrasch's trap in the Steinitz Ruy Lopez. And the key feature in that line is that it ended with the bishop fork of the rook on f8 and the knight on c5. Well, what if that fork didn't exist? Well, let's go to a variation where black does not have a rook on f8. White has just played queen takes queen. Now we already saw what happened after rook takes d8 from a8, but let's look at the other rook capture. Well, white plays the same moves. Knight takes, bishop takes, knight takes, and then knight to d3. And now black has the same issue on the e file, so he guards it with f5, and then after f3, bishop to c5 check. And now this knight takes bishop does nothing, because the bishop to g5 move is not dangerous, because there's no rook on f8 to fork the knight with. So in this position, knight takes bishop is not good enough. White should shift his king over. Now he's threatening pawn takes knight if the knight doesn't move, and if the knight does move, then there's knight takes bishop. So black still has a problem. The only resource he has to avoid losing a piece right away is to play rook to f8. Now pawn takes knight would be a bad move, because pawn takes is a discovered check from the rook, and the pawn is threatening to take the knight. So the knight has to jump into f4. And now black equalizes with the unlikely pawn to e3. This move cuts off the bishop from the knight on f4, which is pinned, so white is going to have to give the piece back. If bishop takes, then bishop takes, and rook takes f4, and the game is equal. After e3, if white plays g3 instead to guard his piece, then after g5, it's the same thing but with one less pair of pawns. Rook takes, pawn takes, rook takes check. So, after rook to f8, this capture is not the best move. The best move actually is king to e2. It looks real funny to put your king in front of your rook on the open file like this, but it's tactically justified because, again, the threat is pawn takes knight, and if the knight moves, then there's knight takes bishop. So this move, king to e2, wins a piece. The best black has is, say, after bishop to d6, pawn takes, knight to f2. Again, white remains a piece ahead. So that is the Tarrasch's trap, both after rook f takes d8 and rook a takes d8. White has a winning advantage. So if you play the Steinitz defense for black, you should be aware of this trap, and in this position, instead of castling, you should be prepared to give up the center by playing pawn takes pawn. And after knight takes, white will have a space advantage in the center, but black will not be losing. So you have to be ready to play this kind of position if you want to play the Steinitz against the Ruy Lopez. Perhaps in other lectures I will talk about more active defenses to the Ruy Lopez than this, but I think this trap is very important to know. if you want to play as black against the Ruy. Well, I'll talk to you later.